After an entire year of jokes and melia, Esther has finally returned as the true Neo-Vision Easter unit. But it's not Easter by any means, so you know what? Let's get hyped for Neo-Vision Sylvie! Stormseeker Esther's Trustmaster reward is a materia that raises attack and defense by 60%, then gives a 25% physical killer against demons, machines, stone, and reaper enemies. 60% is a decent stat buff, and the 4 killers have a promising level of variety, but 25% just isn't that high. As a result, it's rare that this will be optimal, even though it's by no means bad. Her Super Trustmaster reward is a 2-handed greatsword, which currently holds the crown for the highest attack Super Trustmaster rewards. Not only that, but it has some additional passives as well. When given to Esther, it grants her 500 extra attack, and a 75% limit burst damage boost, which isn't limited at all. Onto her active abilities. Most of Esther's attacks partially ignore the enemy's defense while dealing non-elemental damage. True Storm Brand imbues lightning onto her, boosts her lightning damage by a tremendous 60%, lowers the enemy's lightning resistance by 135%, and then fills Esther's limit burst gauge by a little over 1/3. Energizing Bunny raises her attack, defense, and spirit by 300%, gives her entire team a 120% physical killer buff against demons, machines, stone, and reaper enemies, raises their accuracy by 50%, and fills Esther's limit burst gauge by the same amount. Quantum Storm gives one ally a specific ability, Chain Lightning, a lightning physical attack that chains with EN. What is this EN, you ask? Why, it's Extreme Nova, a family which allegedly only has 2 moves. Maybe one day they'll add Extreme Nova to the list. All jokes aside, for a decent ability the cooldown is pretty unforgiving, 20 whole turns. Bolting Slice lowers the enemy's defense by 87%, then chains before capping with a single strong blow that gets stronger with each use. It also fills Esther's limit burst gauge and chains with Bolting Strike. Bolting Impact is a bit different. It's still non-elemental, but it also inflicts a 20% accuracy reduction effect and chains with Stardust Ray. Calm Before the Storm is a rechargeable Magnus ability, which requires 3 batteries each use. You can get 3 batteries by using her limit burst, more on that later. The ability itself inflicts a 30% Greatsword Imperil, chains of Bolting Strike, raises her limit burst damage by a massive 300%, then straight up raises the damage modifier of her limit burst, and finally fills her limit burst gauge by 2/5. Passives. But for Trustmaster reward or Super Trustmaster reward equipped, including the ones from the normal Esther, Esther will gain equipment attack when carrying a single weapon, plus increased accuracy. She also gets 4 different killers, which have been mentioned throughout this video. By the way, this is actually a Brave ability, and because the game is smart, it shows you the ability at base level. At max level, the equipment attack boost doubles, the physical killers triple, and her normal attack changes to a dual-casted Bolting Strike. Speaking of killers, she has Physical Bahamut equipped. It's not much, but it's a nice baseline. She also meets 2/3 of the limit burst damage cap, and boasts a 50% boost to physical evasion. Esther also has a Brave ability passive, which when raised will raise the chain damage, meets half the boost to the chain cap limit, and we've already seen these effects. At EX plus 2, she'll get 500 attack and access to Surging Energy, an automatic ability which will raise your team's limit burst damage by 250%, and their limit burst gauge fill rate by 150%. Let's look at her limit burst. Bunny Boat Blitz, an extra 10 points for alliteration, raises her attack by 350%, then deals damage that chains of Extreme Nova. It also recharges that Magnus ability by 3 levels, including the one on her Brave Shift, and activates an area effect that boosts limit burst damage. Speaking of which, time to change forms. Stormseeker Esther has a true Brave Shift, which has no limitations whatsoever. Onto her active abilities. In this form, Esther's attacks are still non-elemental, but while they no longer partially ignore the enemy's defense, they also scale off her defense stat instead. Shatterbolt is a prime example of what I just said. It also lowers the enemy's attack and magic by 80% and fills her morale gauge by a nice amount, all while chaining with Bolting Strike. However, each use requires 1/10 of Esther's limit burst gauge. Discharge and Recharge will cost 1/5 of the limit burst gauge, but in return it removes all debuffs from Esther. Any breaks, stop, and charm from your team, grants them resistance to said debuffs, and lets Esther counterattack. Storm Defender requires a little under 1/2 of her limit burst gauge. It removes any cover effects from your team, and then turns Esther into a physical tank, with a strong mitigation cover, grants your team a 60% physical and magical mitigation buff, and gives Esther 4 evasion stacks. Boundless Status requires a little over 1/3 of her limit burst gauge. In return, it grants Esther a Provoke, gives her a 75% physical and magical mitigation buff, gives her an additional 75% physical mitigation buff against 4 different species, and lets her evade 4 attacks. Storm Guardian requires 1/10 of her limit burst gauge, which is pretty lenient, but it also has a 10-turn cooldown. It grants Esther a whopping 90% physical and magical mitigation buff, gives her team a 75% physical and magical mitigation buff, then gives them an HP barrier that scales with morale. It also lets Esther evade 5 attacks. Electromagnetic Shield is the rechargeable Magnus ability. It doesn't require any Limit Burst crystals, but the MP cost is sure to make up for that. The ability itself grants Esther an ultimate cover, boosts her defense by 350%, gives her 75% physical mitigation buff, lowers her lightning resistance by 100%, but in return lets your team absorb lightning damage for 3 turns anyways, so it's really not a drawback. Passives. But for Trustmaster Reward or Super Trustmaster Reward equip, including the ones from the normal Esther, Esther gains equipment defense when carrying a single weapon. She also gets a Guts buff. Again, this is also a Brave ability that's shown at its base level. If you raise it to the max, the stat buff doubles. She gets triple the Guts buff. She automatically activates a physical cover at the start of the battle while filling 1/5 of her Limit Burst gauge, and her normal attack chains while healing her team. Furthermore, Esther retains all her offensive buffs, though her base stats shift a bit towards defense. She also gets a 70% Provoke buff, and at EX plus 2 the stat gain changes to defense. Let's look at her Limit Burst. It activates a ultimate cover, one that's more sturdy than her Magnus ability, and it also gives her a 75% physical and magical mitigation buff. It also gives her a strong re-raise buff, and raises her team's lightning resistance by 150%. Let's rank Brave abilities. Raise them all! Power of the Precursor, Storm for tremendous offensive buffs, Charged Atmosphere for the chain boost and actually possessing killers, and Overcharged Physique for even more abilities. Time to make a damage rotation. I'll be using her as a lightning damage dealer. On turn 1, cast True Storm Brand, Calm Before the Storm, and Bolting Slice. On turn 2, activate her Limit Burst. On turn 3, cast Calm Before the Storm, and double cast Bolting Slice. On turn 4, activate her Limit Burst. On turn 5, triple cast Bolting Slice. Repeat the rotation from here. So, EX2. Amusingly, for a premium unit, Esther can function as a more than capable damage dealer without the need for her Brave Shift. But further EX Awakenings does unlock additional tools, so it's certainly worth the thought. EX plus 2 will automatically raise your team's Limit Burst damage and their Limit Burst gauge fill rate, though Esther herself doesn't really need it. The stat buffs are also appreciated, but in the same vein. Her Super Trustmaster reward is definitely powerful though, but it's not like there are no other ways to get it. At EX plus 3, she'll get her Vision card. It has high stats, but that's to be expected from a premium unit. The conditional stat buffs are reliant on the Greatsword, which, frankly, you could easily just straight up ignore. The 4 physical killers, however, could potentially be tremendous, though of course only when you need them. Lastly, there's a 75% Limit Burst damage buff for units from Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. Amusingly, Esther doesn't need such a drastic boost, and would have benefited more from an extra 500 attack, but oh well, what can you do? Overall, while additional EX Awakenings will certainly increase her strength, there's not a lot of reward for the potential material cost. So how good is Stormseeker Esther? At base, she's a non-elemental damage dealer that prefers to go lightning. Of course, if lightning's not an option, the non-elemental damage will prevent her from being locked and worthless, a common problem for many premium damage dealers. With that in mind, she's incredibly powerful and surprisingly flexible. She has good coverage when it comes to killers, superb passives that give her a strong foundation, and a bit of support, which is always nice to have. Unlock her Brave Shift and you get a physical tank. She's surprisingly reliable in this form as well, with sturdy options, removal and resistance buffs, and the ultimate cover if the need ever arises. If there is one flaw, it's that this form is incredibly reliant on Limit Burst crystals to operate, and Esther doesn't have an immediate source of that like most EX Awakenings. It's really weird that she's missing Warring Spirit, especially as tanking is one of the most important parts of the game. Even though she can fill her Limit Burst gauge easily, that's still one critical turn you're spending without a tank. Of course, all this is easily covered by just bringing in another tank, as that way you can go full damage with Esther, but of course the answer depends on the battle at hand. Overall, Esther is a fantastic unit, who's an excellent addition and almost certainly a safe bet to spend Lapis on. That is, if it weren't for one distinct feature. She's a premium unit that potentially costs 60,000 Lapis. When I think premium, the only units who truly defined the bar were the Final Fantasy VII trio. Everyone else then more or less matched their power level, but were released at a far later time, meaning power creep would soon make their price tag look completely ridiculous. Ultimately, while Esther is certainly one of the top contenders for damage, she's definitely not safe from power creep. But with that in mind, she's still one of the safest and strongest options, especially due to the fact that she's incredibly flexible. Overall, it really depends on the Lapis count. If you can afford to, then you should definitely consider getting her. But if you want the biggest numbers, then the Dragoon Cane banner is still up. Even though he's locked to 2 elements, future changes will drastically raise his damage output. In the end, there's one big question. Flexible, powerful, yet potentially expensive? Or a less flexible finisher whose potential will rise as time passes? It might help if you compare Esther to Full Moon Carton, a fast, flexible unit who can deal strong damage quickly, thus making him an excellent addition in many events. Thanks for watching, and if you liked this video, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below if you get Stormseeker Esther. Personally, I'd love to, but since I don't have enough Lapis, I don't have a fallback with the safety net. Thankfully, I seem to be pretty lucky with off-banner premiums, and, well, I do have a lot of tickets.